epic siege, an invincible army,
I will wipe them out of Judea once and for all.
a final stand.
There'll be no retreat from Masada.
The siege of Masada is the Alamo of the ancient world.
900 people committed suicide here at Masada. It's a story of courageous martyrdom, and of the people here were willing to take their own lives in defense of their traditions and their identity.
You have 10,000 Roman soldiers around you, and they want to kill you, and they will if they can.
I can hardly think of any part of the human drama that's not represented here.
So I can come?
But is it all just a legend? Or did nearly 1,000 men, women, and children really commit suicide rather than be made the slaves of Rome? It's a 2,000-year-old drama, and it's as compelling today as it has ever been.
Freedom or death! Freedom or death! Freedom or death! Freedom or death!
First told at the dawn of Christianity and at a moment of crisis for the Jews, the story of Masada has long fired the imagination of believers and non-believers alike. Yet for most of recorded history, it's been little more than a legend. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, everything changes. An overwhelming body of archaeological evidence is uncovered. A ruined mountain fortress, a siege ramp threatening its walls, a network of fortified Roman camps. Taken together, they pinpoint Masada on the map. This is the indisputable site of an epic contest between the Roman army and a besieged community of Jews. From the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, Masada is an icon for the nation.
Masada's a symbol for Israelis, so they can connect to moments in history.
This becomes the Alamo. Remember that Masada shall never fall again. But it also becomes a very human tale about conflict and freedom and determination and resolution and possibility and disappointment.
An almost mythic site, it serves as a mirror to history. A place that beckons artists and ideologues as much as archaeologists and generals. Today, a new generation of storytellers has been drawn to the epic of Masada. This time, though, the action is unfolding on a movie lot in Malta in the Mediterranean.
Set, 3, 2, 1, action! And go!
This is the set of the Dovekeepers. It's a CBS limited event series based on the best-selling novel of the same name by Alice Hoffman. For the series producers, doing this story justice is about more than drama and ratings. It's about providing a legacy for generations to come.
It's important to be authentic, because you're creating a piece of art which lasts for decades and probably will be looked at not only on television but in schools. This will probably become the foremost piece of work on Masada, I think.
We have the best gathered here to create all this ambience to bring this world alive.
We went to visit Israel and to go to the real Masada to actually get a sense of it and get a feel of it and get an idea of what you then have to try to achieve and making it work with the script and the words that you're given.
Sam Neill plays one of the male leads at the core of the Dovekeepers story, Flavius Josephus. But there's nothing fictional about his character. A renowned historian, Josephus's writings encompass the entire history of the Jews.
I did reference Josephus quite a bit, and have referenced records or stories about him and why he would have dressed the way he dresses.
Though born to a Jewish mother who claims royal ancestry and a Jewish father of priestly descent, Josephus is as at home in Rome as he is in Jerusalem. In fact, by his own admission, Josephus is a Roman collaborator, and his opinions of his fellow Jews can be withering. Yet, he will also write The Jewish War, his history of the Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire that culminates with the siege of Masada. Outside of the New Testament of the Bible, it is the principal literary source for everything we know about the Holy Land during the 1st century of Christianity.
You travel Israel with 2 books in your hand, and one is the Bible, of course, and the other is Josephus, The Jewish War. Now, the book is absolutely invaluable.
Here we go. Ready?
It's thanks to Josephus that one of the indelible dramas of the ancient world can still be recounted today.
And 3, 2, 1, action!
Stay away from the walls. Do not let them count our numbers. Let them think we have thousands of warriors.
2,000 years ago, Rome dominates the world. The authority of its Emperor Nero extends from northwestern Europe to Judea and the borders of modern-day Iraq. Its strategic significance at the intersection of multiple trade routes outweighs its distance from the seat of power.
Judea was enormously wealthy and enormously important to the Romans. There we are, the corridor between Asia and Europe and Africa and Arabia, and you've got to go through us, put up a toll booth, and you're printing money.
It's that same wealth that transforms Masada from a natural redoubt into a fortress. Already an ancient settlement, its heyday arrives in the reign of King Herod the Great. The fortifications and palaces he builds at Masada are among the most ambitious in the ancient world, and the most astounding. Its eastern side is rimmed by a sheer drop to the Dead Sea Valley 1,300 feet below. Its western edge towers hundreds of feet above the surrounding terrain. And yet, in Josephus's account, access to its summit is limited to a narrow, zigzagging pathway called the Snake. Remarkably, it's still visible and in use today.
There's a great debate among the scholars as to whether Josephus's account of Masada is reliable or not. But if you come out here with the book open and walk around, it's very easy to see all the things that he talks about. For example, the snake path, he mentions that. He says that's the only access as it winds up, and there it is, after 2,000 years.
The evidence uncovered by generations of Israeli archaeologists, beginning with the excavations of Yigael Yadin in the 1960s, strongly supports the broad outlines of Josephus's account, with one significant exception.
Well, according to Josephus, 900 people committed suicide here at Masada. The only 3 bodies that were found in the initial excavations were found here, right under where I'm standing, in the lower level of Herod's enormous and beautiful northern palace. We don't really know how these bodies got here or what happened to them. They were the bodies of a young man, a girl in her late teens, and a child.
Despite more than 50 years of archaeological excavations, only 3 sets of human remains have ever been recovered from inside Masada's walls. The silence of the other victims only adds to the power of Josephus's account.
We should care about Masada because it's one of the most important battles in Western civilization. It might seem like this is just a battle about 900 people versus the Romans, but it's actually a story that becomes particularly important for Jewish courage and identity.
In order to understand the mystery and majesty of Masada, we must first travel north, 2 days' march to Jerusalem, where Josephus' story begins. It is the year 66, and the Roman province of Judea and its capital city are about to go up in flames. Jerusalem, the epicenter of the Jewish world. The place where, according to religious Jews, Abraham sought to sacrifice Isaac until God stayed his hand. But even as Jews of different creeds stand before their God, it's a place of underlying tensions. Today, they're between Jews and Arabs. 2,000 years ago, they were between Jerusalem and Rome.
First century Palestine was just a hotbed of simmering political tension and religious fervor and hope. The Jews were oppressed. They had been oppressed by a succession of empires. They were very hungry. They had been taxed very harshly. And they were hoping that they were going to have a Messiah that was going to lead them to freedom.
But according to the historian Josephus and the archaeological evidence, the Jews harbored just as much resentment for each other as they do for Rome.
Well, what we're looking at here are the remains of a series of urban villas, mansions, from the 1st century AD. And it's clear that these mansions belonged to Jerusalem's wealthiest residents, to the Jerusalem elite. And what you see in Josephus's descriptions of, the 1st century is a description of a society that is really riven by these socioeconomic and religious divisions into various factions and groups. And so it's kind of a situation where everything is beginning to bubble over.
Built on the site of Solomon's temple, different sects of Jews are fighting each other for this, the Second Temple. It's a bitter, bloody contest.
So it's almost a battle of messiahs, I would call it, because each of them has a leader. And these are not just military leaders. They're in each case someone who thinks that they should be the one to lead the nation.
The fiercest of the factions is a group Josephus calls the Sicarii. They play a major role in the CBS miniseries The Dovekeepers. And they're as willing to take up arms against Roman soldiers as they are against their fellow Jews.
And the name Sicarii comes from the shape of the curved knife that they were supposed to have used in warfare.
Josephus basically calls them terrorists and murderers. They're slitting people's throats. They're the dagger people. But they would probably say, look, we're under Roman oppression. And when you're oppressed, and you fight against that oppression, you have every right to use violence and to do whatever you can.
Ready, and 3, 2, 1, action!
It's only a wall.
According to Josephus, this man, Eleazar ben Yair, will ultimately rally the Sicarii against the all-powerful Roman Empire. Played by Mito Hamada in The Dovekeepers, it's Ben Yair who will convince his followers to lay down their own lives rather than surrender.
There'll be no retreat from Masada!
But in the year 66, such events are far in the future. Far more pressing is Rome's failure to quell a mounting insurgency in Judea.
There was a riot, a simple riot between Jews and pagans. The riot got out of control.
This just ignited tensions and hostility in Jerusalem. This group of radicals, the Zealots, started cleansing Jerusalem of any kind of Roman emblems and architecture. They attacked Roman citizens, and they drove out of Jerusalem those that they saw as collaborating with the Romans.
Now, once there's a fight between the Roman legions and the Jews of Judea, then it's not a riot anymore. Then it's revolution.
There's no turning back. I mean, you've basically hit Rome in the chin, and there's going to be a reaction.
And in the year 67, Rome does react with overwhelming force. When word reaches the Emperor Nero, then in Greece, he dispatches General Vespasian to Syria. His son Titus sails to Alexandria in Egypt, musters the 5th and 10th legions, and then brings them alongside his father's forces in Syria. Their goal, the total subjugation of the Jewish state.
Vespasian arrives in 67, and he's quickly joined by his son Titus, who had been in Alexandria in Egypt. They bring with them the 10th Legion and a number of other important Roman armies. They have about 60,000 troops.
Vespasian and his legions ran through Judea like a steamroller gone berserk. And by the end of the first year, he had already captured most of the Galilee.
Vespasian's armies lay waste to Judea. Only then does his attention turn to Jerusalem.
Vespasian is actually called away to become emperor, and Titus is left to sort of marshal forces.
Finally, in a 3-pronged attack, Titus's forces bear down on Jerusalem.
He'd been avoiding it because it's this huge defended stronghold, and they knew there was going to be a very long siege there.
Archaeologist Shimon Gibson has dug at the very site where Titus's forces laid siege to the city.
What you see behind me are the medieval city walls of Jerusalem, built by Suleiman the Magnificent in the mid-16th century. But the original walls that stood here at the time of Titus were very impressive. Twice as high, very, very thick, massive towers and bastions on all sides. This is the weak and vulnerable place in the fortification system. You have this gate, and it's through here, probably with battering rams. They remove the gate and they break through, and you've got this wave of soldiers entering and climbing up these steps and then entering into the upper city. And finally, they're able to conquer the city.
But Titus's objective isn't merely the surrender of Jerusalem.
Loose!
His goal is its utter destruction.
Anyone who tried to escape was crucified. Perhaps as many as 500 were dying a day.
Thousands of Jews perish. Some trying to hide in the sewers are slaughtered underground.
The temple is in flames. The Romans have destroyed the city. 2,000 Jews came fleeing down here, hoping to escape. Look back! They thought they could get through the sewer, but they couldn't in the end, and they died in here. And the destruction of Jerusalem came to a horrible end.
For many Jews, it's as if the end of days has come. Still, one last bastion of Jewish resistance remains. Its name is Masada. In the year 70, the worst fears of the Jewish people are realized. Jerusalem has fallen. Their temple has been destroyed. Writing just a few years later, the historian Josephus tells us his people had fallen under the spell of apocalyptic prophecy. But the Jewish Messiah didn't come.
This seemed like the end of the world. The temple's destroyed. The last holdouts have been destroyed.
All that is, except Masada. Once a luxury fortress for King Herod, then a Roman garrison. Now it's in the hands of one of the most notorious rebel groups in recorded history.
Long before Titus had laid siege to Jerusalem, a particularly virulent group of zealots known as the Sicarii, who had been warring with other zealot groups in Jerusalem, had fled to Masada.
This is just such a prize as they looked up and realized that from this spot we'll have weapons, we'll have food, we'll be safe.
When the Sicarii came here, they used some kind of a ruse to get in. Perhaps they pretended to be Roman sympathizers or something.
They take over Masada. They find an amazing situation there. They have this wonderful mountain fortress with storerooms full to the ceilings almost, with all sorts of foodstuffs, an armory, which make it an ideal place for a group of military extremists.
And Masada is more than just a well-stocked desert mountain hideaway. King Herod also endowed his refuge with the greatest resource of all, water.
You know, when you come down in this massive cistern that was built by Herod the Great to store water, and this is the most monumental on Masada, naturally you think of water, of survival in the desert. So it's ingenious, it's beautiful, it's impressive.
One of more than a dozen discovered at Masada, this cistern alone can hold over 1 million gallons of water. That's enough to meet the needs of a modern American family for 10 years. Equally impressive is the ingenious system of dams and water channels that kept the cisterns full. All this, plus a fortified wall encircling the plateau, dozens of storehouses, barracks, palaces, and an armory, was now in the hands of the Sicarii. And yet, according to Josephus, one of the first targets of these Jewish rebels would be a desert oasis called En-Gedi, and a community of their fellow Jews just 10 miles from Masada.
2,000 years ago, En-Gedi was known for its production of balsam, which was used in the perfume industry. It may seem just like a small, idyllic coastal town, but it was wealthy, and as a result, that made it a target. A raiding party left Masada and swept down here to En-Gedi, where they slaughtered more than 700 people.
Where some see senseless slaughter, others see strategy.
I do not sympathize with the motivation, but I can understand the motivation of the Sicarii as a dominant group. We know from Pliny the Elder that 5 years following the destruction of Judea, Rome enjoyed the income of hundreds of millions of dollars from En-Gedi. By destroying En-Gedi, they will harm Rome.
But Rome is over 1,400 miles away and preoccupied with its own internal politics.
Once Jerusalem is destroyed, the great temple of Herod is burnt to the ground. The Roman Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus have their triumph toward the winter of 70. There's a kind of a breather, I think.
And it's not only Rome that takes a breather. As the Jewish occupation of Masada endures, its own extremism is tempered by the realities of everyday life.
We think of Masada as occupied by robbers and brigands. We think of it as sort of a manly man's world. But in actual fact, and this is really surprising to people, there are a lot of women and children here. And women were an integral part of this community.
Of course, they had wives and children, and you can see that in terms of the archaeological finds from Masada. There's spindle walls, which indicate that they were making cloth and tapestries and weaving carpets and things like that. And then you have all sorts of other things, combs and things like that, which indicate that this was a very sort of varied sort of lifestyle that was undertaken by the people living at Masada.
More than a historian, Candida Moss has been a longtime consultant to the producers of the CBS limited event series, The Dovekeepers. Its exploration of the role of women at Masada revolves around a singular structure at the site. It's called a columbarium.
So we here at the columbarium, which is just a fancy word for a dovecote, women were responsible for tending the birds that were kept here. And we may not think that this is very important, but these birds were important not just because they were a source of food in their own right and they produced eggs, but because bird droppings were one of the principal sources of high nitrogen fertilizer, which they needed to grow all kinds of things up here. So I think we can take dovekeepers as a symbol and a sign of the unseen roles that women played in the ancient world.
This is like a little city. It's like a little colony that they're able to have in the midst of this turmoil that's throughout the land.
But there are changes underway. And this time, thanks to a remarkable archaeological discovery, we can rely on the rebels' own words to fill in the blanks. Archaeologists call these pottery fragments ostraca. They are the simple but functional post-it notes of antiquity. Masada's communal bakery even used them to ration out loaves of bread.
They're rationing chips for groups of people, and they found 10 of these. And it actually names the leader of the group and how much bread that group is going to get on a daily and weekly basis.
And one of those group leaders' names? It's Eleazar ben Yair, the commander of the Sicarii.
You can see today in the museum this beautiful ostraca with explicit name of Ben Yair, a rare name that appears only in the accounts of Josephus and in the archaeological record. So for me, this is amazing. But there were not only Sicarii at the site.
2 years have passed since the destruction of Jerusalem. Masada is undergoing a transformation. Now it's home to Jews from different traditions.
That's why I think we get in the archaeological record this idea of maybe as many as 10 diverse groups that all have different customs about diet and religious ritual and observance.
The Sicarii, once the scourge of their fellow Jews, may not be rolling out the welcome mat, but Masada is no longer an exclusive community. Some religious texts from Masada are comparable to the famous Dead Sea Scrolls found in the nearby Jewish community of Qumran. It's evidence that a Jewish sect, the Essenes, were also living here.
The Essene had a sort of a secluded area for themselves. It was necessary for them to keep on the belief and practice.
There's also evidence of Samaritans and other Jewish groups coming to Masada, as if for a final stand.
So where did that come from? I think it came from the sinking ship, basically. That many, many people from all over are thinking, where do we go now? We go to Masada. And at that point, I think, those original rebels, they're willing to let their fellow countrymen join them.
We're now, let's say, 2 to 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem. Every other fortress and holdout in the country has been subdued by the Romans. They had their victory parade in Rome. And really, so what did they care if a small band of Jewish crazies held out on this remote mountain in the middle of the wilderness on the fringes of the Roman world? What did they care?
In fact, the passage of time does nothing to diminish the threat from Rome. In the year 73, General Flavius Silva is made governor of Judea. His mandate, eliminate all Jewish resistance.
Looking out at that huge Roman camp, I don't think I've ever seen anything more chilling. Imagine coming here to provide food for your family. Well, just outside the walls, there's this mass of Roman soldiers, thousands of them, armed to the hilt. And they have one single objective. That's to annihilate you and your family off the face of the planet.
In the year 70, the Roman army crushes the Jewish revolt in Jerusalem. 2 years later, a single rebel force remains. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, it numbers less than 1,000. Its leader is Eleazar ben Yair. Its stronghold, the fortress of Masada.
Two years after the fall of Jerusalem, the Romans arrive at the bottom of Masada.
In the CBS limited events series, The Dovekeepers, the Roman general Flavius Silva, the newly appointed governor of Judea, is the face of Rome's military might.
So the Roman troops presumably would have come from the west, which even today is the easiest way to approach Masada. Presumably the people on top of the mountain would have begun to see them from a distance because they're elevated above the rest of the area.
For Roman military historian Jody Magnus, these rocks reveal secrets of the impending siege.
When the Romans arrived at the foot of Masada, they set up a siege, which means they built a wall completely encircling the base of the mountain to cut it off, what's called a circumvallation wall.
The siege wall is still visible today. Its contours, just as they were 2,000 years ago.
It's about 4,000 yards long. Originally, it was about 10 to 12 feet high, built of stone, with watchtowers along the way. And the idea was to seal off the mountain to make sure that nobody inside the mountain could escape, nobody could get in to help them, and posted guards along the length of the wall to make sure that nobody was trying to climb over.
And the siege wall the rebels stare down on is only the beginning.
They built 8 camps to house their soldiers, and we're located in one of the 2 legionary camps, what's called Camp F.
Each camp is strategically located so as to fully encircle the mountain. There will be no escape from Masada.
What you see around you look like piles of rubble, but these were actually the walls of the camp. So we have a fortification wall that encircled the camp that was originally 10 to 12 feet high, and within the area of the fortification wall, we have low stone walls that were originally about 4 feet high that were the bases of leather tents, because when the Romans conducted a campaign in the field, they pitched tents. So what we're looking at here is rubble that belongs to the walls of this siege camp.
And in the meantime, the people who are living here are watching this unfold in front of them. They can see their fate approaching them.
Flavius Silva and his troops could actually see the Jewish rebels on top of the mountain, and they could even talk to them. So you have to imagine the Jews and the Romans shouting insults back and forth at each other.
Though the Roman forces likely outnumber the Jews 10 to 1, the fortress seems impregnable. There's just one narrow pathway up the mountain, and his enemies have the advantage of higher ground. But Flavius Silva is undaunted. He calls for his engineers to design and build a massive ramp, wide enough to support a siege tower and a battering ram. If it's to reach the top of the mountain, the ramp will need to be 375 feet tall. Its remains are still visible today.
When the Romans built the siege ramp at Masada, they did it in a very sophisticated sort of way that used the principles of structural engineering. They didn't just pile up masses of dirt and stones, but they built a wooden framework with wooden timbers that were laid horizontally and then wooden timbers that were stuck in vertically to create giant boxes. And these boxes were then filled up with stones. 2,000 years later, we can still see pieces of the original wood framework sticking out of the sides of the ramp.
It takes a huge amount of manpower to build the siege works. Unskilled labor as well as skilled.
One of the myths that you hear repeated often about Masada is that it was Jewish slaves who built the siege works and the ramp, and that is actually not true. Josephus does say, and I'm sure that this is correct, that Jewish slaves worked as sort of those who were carrying stuff, so they were kind of the schleppers, if you want. But the people who actually built the siege works were the Roman soldiers, because they knew how to build the siege works. They knew what needed to be done. So this was their job. This is what you were trained to do.
Eleazar and his followers can only watch and wait.
There's no real resistance. The Jews can only stand on top of the mountain and look down and see what the Romans are doing.
For the Romans, speed is of the essence.
So the Romans obviously would have wanted to have kept the siege as short as possible. They had to bring water, supplies, food in for their soldiers, for all of the servants and slaves, for the pack animals every day. And they had supply lines going for miles and miles in every direction.
Estimates for the siege works build time vary wildly.
So if we want to take a range of estimates, it would have been, let's say, somewhere from a minimum of 7 weeks up to maybe a maximum of a half a year, 6 months. I personally think that the lower end, that is the more minimal end, is more correct.
7 weeks or 6 months. It takes the ceaseless energy of thousands to fulfill General Silva's audacious plan. Only then can the fighting begin.
Destroy it!
Well, Josephus actually says that they used catapults and ballistas. These sorts of things would have been used at about the time that the ramp was being completed and the battering ram was being set up on top of the ramp. So the Romans, while they're getting these last pieces of the siege machinery into place, would have had to have provided cover fire for their men to keep the heads of the Jews down so that they can get their siege machinery up and into place.
For Flavius Silva, the conquest of Masada is at hand.
So according to Josephus, the Romans batter through Herod's fortification wall.
A fire that was burning and the wind shifted and so forth.
Eleazar and the rebels seem out of options. But there is one left that no one has foreseen.
Gather the people!
For some reason, the Romans retreated. It's unclear whether or not we can believe Josephus on this. But Josephus tells us that Eleazar, the leader of the group here, gathered everyone together and made an impassioned speech in which he told them that the end was near.
Our enemy is upon us, and we can hold him back no longer.
And they made the decision, rather than surrender the Romans, and the women being raped and sent away as slaves, and the men being crucified, and the children sold away into the copper mines, wouldn't it be more noble to choose death?
Let us go out of this world with our wives and children free.
And that rather than allowing things to be drawn out and to be slaughtered by the Romans, they should instead commit suicide, leaving the food supplies untouched so the Romans would know that it wasn't that they starved to death. According to Josephus, they then drew lots. Some people were reluctant to kill their wives and children, and 10 men were chosen to kill the other men, and a final man killed the rest.
And each family will lie down together. He even says they hugged each other and kissed each other. And these 10 went around with swords and stabbed them through.
For the founders of the modern Israeli state, this was a canonical event. Masada became the symbol of national unity. Today, its mythic power is unquestionable. But haunting questions linger. Where are the undiscovered remains of those other hundreds of men, women, and children who died? it's a search that's far from over. The Siege of Masada, the story of a band of rebels and a final stand against the might of Rome.
Freedom or death! Freedom or death! Freedom or death! Freedom or death!
The words of the Jewish historian Josephus, written 2,000 years ago, represent the only contemporary account. It's an epic tale repeated down the centuries, and now retold in a major CBS television series. As the story reaches its climax, the Roman army batters down the walls of a fortress built by Herod the Great.
This is the point when Josephus says it's getting dark. The Romans' plan then is to, make the final entry into the mountain in the morning when it becomes light.
According to Josephus, the next day dawns to an eerie silence, not the sounds of war. When the Roman general Flavius Silva enters the fortress, he finds a handful of survivors and the remaining 960 rebels dead, victims of mass murder and suicide.
There are two sources of information for what happened here at Masada. One is Josephus's account, and then we have the archaeology. And they're not necessarily incompatible with each other, but the problem is that archaeology and literary sources provide different kinds of information. So it's a matter of how do you reconcile those two things? Do they contradict each other? Do they complement each other? What do they tell us?
Also, like the victims, Josephus is himself a Jew. Did this story move him? Did he thus embellish his account?
Is he reliable? Well, we're worried about his numbers. He likes to exaggerate. All the numbers that he gives, 10,000 this, and this battle was 20,000, and this was 30,000. Here he says 960. So it makes you wonder whether he had more of a count here. And then he talks about the survivors, 5 children and 2 women came up out of a cistern, maybe this cistern, and he actually gives the numbers.
Much of Josephus's account is backed up by physical evidence. The Roman camps, the siege ramp, the artifact bearing the name of Ben Yair. But other elements run counter to the siege tactics typically deployed by Rome.
The problem with Josephus' story is it doesn't really make a lot of sense. For example, he says that the Romans retreated after they had breached the walls. Why would they do that when they could just push forward and conquer then and there? It seems very unlikely that the Romans would have behaved like this.
Our God does not allow.
Then there's the impassioned speech of Eleazar ben Yair, convincing his followers to choose death over slavery.
But we cannot be slaves!
They had this meeting, a council of men, and the commander, according to Josephus, gives this long speech. Sounds like Plato. Don't weep for me, my soul can escape all of this, and the body will be left, and so forth.
It makes for a powerful story, but there do seem to be holes in the account.
The problem is we don't really have the bodies to back up a mass suicide pact, nor do we have any kind of corroborating evidence about sort of everyone being in one place. It doesn't seem like they would fit in one place. And it doesn't seem like there would have been time for a very organized speech, a gathering of everyone together, and a very sort of comprehensive suicide pact.
The most compelling aspect of the story is also the one that's hardest to believe. For devout Jews of all traditions, suicide is considered a crime against God.
In Judaism, suicide is not regarded as a viable option. If these are God-fearing people, as we understand from the evidence from the synagogue with the scrolls and so forth, yes, taking into account that they're not just the Sicarii, but zealots and other refugees all grouped together in Masada, there would have been a discussion there, and I'm sure some of them would have disagreed with the notion of a suicide pact.
What probably happened is that some people did commit suicide. If no one committed suicide, then the Roman leader, Flavius, would have noticed that when he read Josephus' story in Rome. So it seems likely that some fires were started, some people committed suicide, and everyone else was just slaughtered by the Romans.
Whether by their own hand or by Roman swords, 960 people cannot die without a trace. Yet, despite years of excavations at Masada by the renowned Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin, few human remains have ever been recovered.
In the initial excavations, Yadin found here in the lower part of Herod's palace 3 skeletons of a young man, a girl in her late teens, and a child. We don't really know what happened to them. They died and were discovered in the rubble of the palace.
Yadin believed these remains corroborated Josephus' account, but such claims are met with skepticism today.
The remains of 3 skeletons were found. Yadin interpreted it as an evidence for the accuracy of Josephus. We now know that we should be cautious about that.
We know that they died here, but we don't really know how. Did they commit suicide? Were they murdered by the Romans? Did the palace just collapse on them and they were trapped?
But Yadin did discover one other cache of human remains. And tellingly, they weren't found inside the garrison's walls. Today, James Tabor is preparing to rappel off the southern rim of Masada. It's a vertical drop of 1,300 feet to the valley below. His goal, to locate the cave where those other bodies were found. It clings to the very edge of the fortress.
So I can come?
It's a hideout that's just outside Masada's walls. As many as 24 people may have huddled in this cave, praying to escape detection by the Roman soldiers.
This is very emotional to me to try to imagine in April of 73, the year 73, there were 24 people living in this cave. There were cooking utensils, foodstuffs, mats. They can see the Roman camp. And they were found by the excavators. There were 2 piles of bones. One was right here in front of me. The other was just at the other end of the cave. It turns out there were 14 males, 8 females, and the females were from like 14 to 16 years old, and one of them was pregnant. Actually, they found the fetus, and 4 children, so 24 individuals were living here.
The discovery of these remains, far from where the Romans entered the fortress, suggests these victims were not part of any murder-suicide pact.
My guess would be that the Romans checked all the caves, so you picture these people hovering here. Maybe they put up a fight. Weapons weren't found, though. And essentially they were hacked to death right here.
But there are no questions we can pose to the bones. In Israel, the rabbinical authorities require that any Jewish remains found during archaeological excavations are immediately reburied. But there are those, including the site's chief archaeologist, who believe the rest of the bodies may, one day, be found.
The fact that the Roman army stayed on top of the mountain for 2 or 3 months thereafter, just from normal behavior of a human being, being surrounded by 960 corpses, you would like to get rid of them, whether you respect them or not. There are 2 options. One, a mass grave. But I think another possibility should be take into consideration is the fact that the Roman used cremation. And I think that within the next few years that we'll be able to find the remains. They should be somewhere out there.
A last intimate testament does remain. Displayed at the Masada Museum, it's a lock of human hair from one of the 3 victims found inside Masada.
This hair, which is not really considered part of the body, and yet it is, in such a personal way, representing a human being, who did die here. And it's just to contemplate it and look at it is really, really moving to me. What it symbolizes really is the whole story of Masada right here in front of our eyes.
When you're on Masada, it's really easy to see the emotion of it. I mean, you may not like Josephus, but he writes brilliantly, and that's a heartbreaking story. You can understand what these guys were going through.
You can hardly think of a story from the ancient world that has this kind of human touch to it, where you begin to identify and try to imagine what was it like, and was that the right choice? It actually raises the question, it's a perennial question for human beings, when do you choose to live and when do you choose to die?